and the health qualification providers all to take part in the task force.
I'm grateful for the compliment paid, and it was a privilege to be involved. I should declare my interest in palliative care. Given that the number of children with life-limiting and life-threatening conditions has more than doubled in the last 20 years, particularly in the 0 to 19-year-old age group, especially in the under-ones, does the government recognise the importance of early involvement of multi-professional specialist palliative care teams, where they can support families to come to terms with what they have to come to terms with, can help the other clinicians understand the family's perspective and avoid some of these disputes happening in the first place? And therefore, can the Minister tell us how many of the integrated care boards have commissioned specialist palliative care services that work between hospitals, ICUs, wards, out into the community and into hospices?
So the noble lady is correct. The number of young people with life-limiting conditions has actually gone up from about 33,000 at around about 2001-2 to about 87,000 more recently. Of course, a lot of that is actually conversely good news in that we've got more and more treatments that can keep these children alive for longer. But clearly that does provide the wraparound type service that the noble lady is talking about. It is a responsibility of the ICBs to provide that, and I will provide details into the progress the individual ones have done on that when we meet.
My Lords, just to emphasise, the task force recommended by Nuffield to oversee its key recommendations needs to get to work urgently. The family-focused research work with parents, including parent carers, about their experience of shared decision-making with healthcare professionals on care and treatment is vital, as is the comprehensive information and guidance for parents and staff that's called for across the 16 Nuffield recommendations. What timescales is the government envisaging for this crucial work to commence and become operational, including guidance to clinical and ethical committees?
So my understanding now that the task force composition has been set up, that it will be, it is being arranged shortly. I completely agree with the noble lady that these are important and heart-wrenching matters often. So urgency is required on it all. As I say, good progress has been made in a number of areas already. The MOG is also setting up a roundtable around this. We've got the regional conflict managers. They have been established. We've got the training courses online so the communication can improve. So a lot is being done, and the task force will push that forward further.
My Lords, the Minister will know that there is currently an imbalance between the resources available to parents of children, parents and guardians of children involved in end-of-life care, particularly time, money, legal advice, between them and public bodies such as NHS trusts. Compounding that issue is the routine use of secret transparency orders, which prevent scrutiny and oversight of court proceedings, particularly in the family court. Does he agree with me in that respect that secret justice is no justice at all?
No, clearly these processes, these terrible cases have got to be as transparent as possible. Legal aid, as noble lords probably do know, is automatically available in all these types of cases to make sure that there is a level playing field, so to speak. But I think we all believe as well there is a role to see, can we use mediation more, because obviously courts should only ever be a last resort.
My Lords, the noble lord, the Minister, has already flagged communication as one of the key areas which comes through in the report, both around palliative care but also around care more generally. Can the noble lord, the Minister, assure us that the task force will have the skills it needs to ensure that that communication can take place with parents from a variety of different backgrounds, educational, with different levels of medical knowledge, with different linguistic and cultural contexts?
Yes, the noble lord is quite correct. We know in many walks of life, so to speak, that there are certain sectors of society that don't get the same level of provision and sometimes miss out. We obviously had the debate last week on maternity, and we saw the instances in ethnic minorities and also people with learning difficulties. So yes, that needs to make sure that all the communications are there, and basically everyone in that sort of situation is armed to really provide the right level of interface and communications in what are some really difficult cases.
Families faced with having critically ill children find it very difficult to access treatment, because it's often specialist treatment that's only available hundreds of miles away from where they live. That puts a tremendous pressure on the family financially. Does the government intend to do any more to help those families?
Well, I mean, clearly, I think we would all agree that, you know, the families need to be the priority in these terrible cases. What we have tried to do, and I did quite a bit of my own research into this as well, to say we've also got the availability of what I call independent funding requests for when there is a new course of treatment which might not be allowed generally on NICE, to give the opportunities in those instances as well. I will come back to the Noble Order about things such as travel support and other expenses.
My Lords, I declare my interest in my work with the Teenage Cancer Trust. And in connection with the task force, would my noble friend let the House know what input charities that specialise in this kind of work with children and teenagers who sadly are in this position and their families to input into the task force? And would he join with me in commending the tremendous work that is done by this charity and the other charities that specialise in helping children and families go through this traumatic time?
Yes, I'm very, very happy to add my own thanks for everything they do in this. It is clear in these sort of circumstances that the more support we can give families, obviously, the better. I will speak to Minister Caulfield to make sure that that input is properly there, because my noble friend is totally correct in ensuring that should be there.
Third oral question, Lord Harris of Haringey.
My Lords, I draw attention to my interest in the register and beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, the Home Office is procuring a new supplier for mobile radio and data services following Motorola's withdrawal from ESN. This means the expected transition to ESN in 2024 and airwave shutdown in 2026 cannot now be achieved. A revised business case will be published this year. This will reflect the impact of procurement activity and the charge control imposed by the Competition and Markets Authority on Motorola in 2023.
My Lords, this is pretty poor, isn't it? The programme was originally announced a decade ago. The switchover was supposed to start in 2017 and completed by 2019. The original cost was a mere 6.2 billion. The last estimate, and that's 2 years out of date, before Motorola withdrew, was 11.3 billion. Only one network provider was prepared to bid. The National Audit Office warned that this is a technology not yet proven in real-world conditions, and it's a system based on mobile phone network creating a single point of failure. So, could the noble Lord tell us, given that the cost has doubled, at least, implementation is at least 14 or 15 years late, there's no guarantee that the existing airwaves system can continue beyond the year after next. If this debacle is not the fault of his department, whose fault is it, and who's taking responsibility?
My Lords, the Noble Lord has asked me a large number of questions, and first to reassure all Noble Lords, there's no reason at all why airwave cannot be extended beyond 2030. In terms of how we got where we got, I think it's worth reminding the House that it was the Home Office that referred Motorola to the Competition and Markets Authority in April 2021, and that resulted in Motorola leaving the Emergency Services Mobile Communications Programme in December 2022. My noble friend, the Chief Whip, answered a question back in 2022, which mentioned the number 11.3 billion, as referred to by the Noble Lord. That was for a programme that was supposed to run between 2015-16 to 2036-37. Unfortunately, any estimates I gave now would not be comparable in terms of duration or end date. The end date is now expected to be 2044. But the CMA charge control, which has been imposed on Motorola, will involve a saving to the taxpayer. The numbers are very much up in the air.
The Minister be able to give us an assurance that the government will look at its original tendering process and find out exactly why this went wrong, because quite clearly it has. And a little aside, would the government give us an assurance that nobody from Fujitsu or their Horizon programme is let anywhere near it?
Well, my lords, this could have been spotted, I suppose, earlier, but the fact is that Motorola's dual role in this arose as a result of Motorola acquiring Airwave at around the same time it was awarded the original contract for ESN. And so the Home Office's options at that point were limited. We sought to agree measures to protect the delivery of ESN, and when it became clear that these measures were insufficient, the Home Office raised its concerns with the Competition and Markets Authority. As regards future suppliers, the contracts will be awarded later this year, but I shall make sure that the Noble Lord's concerns are reflected.
My Lords, the government is supposed to be introducing a new emergency services network. What the Minister has said leaves us all still bewildered about what the actual implementation date is, as my noble friend pointed out. So perhaps the Minister can say the original date was 2017. The implementation date is whatever. When is it going to be working? When are we going to know that we've got a new emergency services network? The Home Office tell us, from what I can see when I looked at it, was 2029. That was actually stated. Is that still correct? In other words, when can we actually have the new emergency services network promised by the government?
Well, my lords, I obviously can't answer that question as precisely as the Noble Lord would like. Yes, 2029 is an aspiration, partly because of the functionality of Airwave, to which I've already referred. But I would also say that some aspects of ESN are already live. 3 ESN products have gone live in the past 2 years. 4G data connectivity for vehicles, which is called Connect, push-to-talk and messaging capability on smartphones, Direct 1 and 2, and a device that can monitor and assess coverage on the move. There's also significant amounts of work that have gone into EAS, which is blanket coverage across the country, and much of the hardware has already been put in place. I think the Noble Lord draws far too bleak a picture.
Including having carried out a review for the Home Office, part of which the Minister's referred to, which was the recommendation to refer to the Monopolies Commission. Because as he explained, Motorola purchased the legacy system and were being paid around 50 million, 250 million, and the new system they were about to deliver was only going to be paid at 50 million. There was no financial incentive to deliver anything, and perhaps consequently they haven't. But I think the major thing that reassured me, the only thing that I've said at the moment that reassures me, is that the government's going to look smartly at whether to discriminate between the radio system and the data production. Because I don't think that the big problem is that nowhere in the world at pace and at scale has anybody shifted a radio system onto a telecommunication system. That's the fundamental problem. The transmission of data is not the issue. We all do that on our phones all the time. But I think we ought to probably carry on delivering the radio as it was and separate the radio off, because if we continue to try and combine them, I do worry that it will become even more undeliverable than it has been to date.
Well, I think the Noble Lord raises a very good point, and I thank him for his perspective, and he's absolutely right that it is the radio supply over the networks that remains critical. As I understand it, and this actually answers the Noble Lord Harris's one of his earlier questions, the technology is more proven than it was when the PAC gave its last comments on this. It is being rolled out in other parts of the world, and from memory, I think Korea is one of the countries that it's being tested in. So I think some of those aspects, at least, have been dealt with.
I apologise for coming back again, but the Noble Lord is essentially applying that this just happened. The Home Office was, Motorola came in and they bought Airwave, and all these things happened like that. But isn't the reality that the negotiations were conducted between highly sophisticated multinational companies who are used to doing negotiations and a bunch of ingenues on the Home Office side? So it's not surprising that the country has been ripped off in this way. Does the Minister agree?
No, I think that's a very unfair characterisation. As I say, and as I said earlier, Motorola bought Airwave. That could not have been foreseen, and therefore, as the Noble Lord Hogan Howes just pointed out, they became in effect a monopoly supplier. That's why the Competition and Markets Authority was involved at the behest of the Home Office, which did the right thing.
Oral question, Baroness Anderson of Stoke-on-Trent.
I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, the recommendations made in both reports the Royal Air Force Aerobatic Team Non-Statutory Inquiry Report and the Command Leadership and Management Report have all been accepted and implemented by the RAF. The findings of the investigations led to action being taken against personnel up to and including dismissal from the service. Behaviours described by the witness in the reports are unacceptable and have no place in the RAF or anywhere else for that matter.
The culture outlined in the reports about the Red Arrows isn't limited to just the RAF. Last month, 60 women in MOD main building complained about the hostile and toxic working environment they face. The amount paid in compensation by the MOD for bullying and harassment has doubled in the last 4 years. These facts will inevitably impact recruitment and retention across our armed forces. So can the Noble Earl tell your Lordship's House how it has come to this and what he is going to do about this seemingly pervasive toxic culture?
The Noble Baroness makes a very serious point, and I've addressed this on a number of occasions from this dispatch box and continue to give the commitment that all the forces are absolutely determined to drive out any unacceptable sexual behaviour. There's nothing that goes on in the MOD now that doesn't address this, and if I look at this particular issue, the whole question of zero tolerance has been brought back into focus, and there are no fewer than 4 measures that have been taken to address this going forward.
My Lords, would my noble friend the Minister agree with me that this shows a very serious failure of command and leadership at both operational and command level? Is he satisfied that this matter was dealt with at a fast enough pace over time? Because it seems to me that the first complaints were made a very long time before anything has happened. I'd be very grateful if my noble friend could look into that.
My noble friend makes a couple of very good points. On the question of timeline, because there was one inquiry led into the next one, it was very important that the thoroughness was followed the whole way through. And the casework that fell out of the NSI, which then flowed into the chain of command investigation, and the casework that followed that, and the investigations that required to be following on from that, made it appear as if it was a relatively slow process. In fact, it wasn't. It was going on at quite a pace. There's an absolute acceptance that was poor leadership. Obviously, I can't comment on individual cases, but all those responsible have been subject to appropriate action.
Baroness Brinton is participating remotely.
My Lords, when the inquiry reports were published in November, the Air Chief Marshal said that it was vital to challenge unacceptable and inappropriate behaviour. Quote, stop, challenge, educate, and if necessary, report situations, end quote. So can the Minister say what training there is for all military and MOD personnel to understand how to intervene and, in the words of report, to stop this bystander culture?
Again, some extremely good points by the Noble Baroness. There is now endemic unacceptable behaviour training, which also addresses active bystander, and in this case, alcohol training as well. There are a number of administrative sanctions that are being put into place, and it's absolutely clear that, specifically in the RAF, there are another 55 positions have been put in place to, on personal support and on the HR side to ensure that this is stopped.
45 years ago, I did the study into whether women should serve at sea in the Royal Navy, and I said they should, and I think it has worked, in fact, very, very well, although there were a lot of people against it at the time. When I did that, we had 55 destroyers and frigates. We now have 16. Does the Noble Lord the Minister feel that that is too few?
Thank the Noble Lord for his question. Yes, I do think it is too few. I think everybody knows that. But it doesn't, however many frigates and destroyers we have, the level of unacceptable behaviour must finish.
That concludes oral questions for today. We now come to some instruments previously debated in Grant Committee. Representation of the People, Postal and Proxy Voting, etc. Amendment Regulations 2024. Baroness Penn.
My Lords, I beg to move the motion standing in my name on the order paper.
Question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as of that opinion will say content. To the contrary, not content. The contents have it. Financial Services Act 2021, Overseas Funds Regime and Recognition of Parts of Schemes. Amendment and Modification. Regulation 2024 and one other motion. Earl Corton on behalf of Baroness Vere of Norbiton.
My Lords, I beg to move the two motions standing in the name of my noble friend.
The question is that the two motions in the name of Baroness Vere be agreed to en bloc. As many as are of that opinion will say content. To the contrary, not content. The contents have it. Safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Bill. Lord Stewart of Dirleton.
Stop it.
Welcome, Lord Stewart of Dirleton.
My Lords, I do begin by craving the indulgence of Lord Speaker in your Lordship's house. I had temporarily stepped outside to collect another piece of paper, and with your Lordship's indulgence, I will now begin to open and beg that this bill now be read a second time. My Lords, I'm speaking to the House today as a member of the government for the bill, not in my formal law officer capacity, and my contributions and responses will reflect this. My Lords, the United Kingdom has a proud history of providing protection for those who are most in need through our provision of safe and legal routes. Since 2015, we have offered over 500,000 people safe and legal routes into the United Kingdom through our Afghanistan, Ukraine and Hong Kong routes. This includes over 28,700 refugees, including over 14,000 children, via our formal refugee resettlement schemes. These established resettlement schemes play a key role in the global response to humanity. Of course.
Got going, but I just wanted him to clarify his opening remarks. Is he saying he's speaking to this House as a general government minister and not in his capacity as a law officer, or did I mishear him?
Your Lordship heard me correctly, and I remind the House of the convention that relates to the law officers, whereby we do not divulge whether or not our opinion has been sought, nor do we divulge the content of that opinion. And it was in order to clarify my position that I was not trespassing upon that convention that I spoke, and I hope that that satisfies the noble Lord. I'm obliged. My Lords, I was discussing the refugee resettlement schemes which this country has in place. These established resettlement schemes play, as I was saying, I think, a key role in the global response to humanitarian crises, saving lives and offering stability to those most in need of protection. But our willingness to help those fleeing war and persecution must be tied to our capacity to do so. And critical to this is tackling illegal migration. There is nothing generous about allowing the status quo to continue. That would only serve the deplorable people smugglers who facilitate these dangerous crossings. It would only put more lives at risk, and it would continue to strain our communities and our public services. As the Prime Minister has made clear, it is the government's priority to stop the boats, and I welcome the fact that this is a shared objective across your Lordship's House. The government is making good progress in stopping the boats. Last year, in 2023, small boat arrivals to the United Kingdom fell by around a third, with Albanian arrivals down by over 90%, whilst we saw illegal entry rise elsewhere in Europe. We have ramped up efforts to prevent crossings and disrupt the smugglers, with particular success stemming from increased collaboration with the French authorities. Our joint work with France prevented over 26,000 individual crossings by small boat to the United Kingdom. Since July 2020, the Joint Intelligence Cell and French law enforcement partners have dismantled 82 criminal gangs responsible for people smuggling of migrants via small boat crossings. As of September 2023, immigration enforcement visits were up 68% compared to the same period in 2022. Last year, the Home Office arrested 92 individuals identified as small boat pilots and 253 people smugglers. In addition, during financial year 2022 to 23, the National Crime Agency conducted what is believed to be the biggest ever international operation targeting criminal networks suspected of using small boats to smuggle thousands to the United Kingdom. The operation saw the seizure of 135 boats and 45 outboard engines. But, my lords, the increase in crossings in recent years means around 51,000 otherwise destitute migrants are currently being accommodated in hotels, costing the taxpayer in excess of £8 million per day. The small boats problem is part of a global migration crisis, a challenge that most of us would accept has no single solution. But this government remains resolute in its commitment to preventing the misuse and evasion of our systems by illegal migrants, stopping these dangerous crossings, and addressing the concerns of the British people. Operationalising the Rwanda scheme is a key part of the government's efforts to deliver this mission, a partnership which has always been part of the wider programme of work to deal with one of the most significant challenges of our time. It is only by fully implementing the Migration and Economic Development Partnership that we will create the strong deterrent necessary to stop these dangerous crossings and break the business model of the criminal gangs. Doing nothing is not an option. My Lords, the Supreme Court's judgment on the 15th of November 2023 concluded that deficiencies in the government of Rwanda's arrangements for determining asylum claims could lead to risks of refoulement. But the Lordships also recognised, explicitly and in terms, that those deficiencies could be addressed in future. In response, the Home Secretary signed a new internationally binding treaty between the United Kingdom and the government of the Republic of Rwanda, which responds to the concerns raised and resolves those issues. The government also introduced the Safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Bill, which buttresses the treaty, confirming that the government of the Republic of Rwanda will fulfil its obligations under the treaty and supporting the relocation of a person to Rwanda under the Immigration Acts. The bill is limited solely to the issue of the safety of Rwanda and relocations to that country, and makes it clear that, with the new treaty, Rwanda is a safe country. This bill also makes clear that Parliament is sovereign and that its acts are valid notwithstanding any interpretation of international law. Let me make clear, my Lords, that this does not mean that doing so legislates away our international obligations, nor does it seek to overrule or contradict the view of the Supreme Court. The purpose of the bill is to say that, on the basis of the treaty and the evidence before it, Parliament believes those obligations to have been met. And the concerns raised by the Court dealt with, not that the government, I beg your Lordship's pardon, and the concerns raised by the Court dealt with, not that the government does not care whether or not they have been. The bill creates a conclusive presumption that the Secretary of State, immigration officers, and courts and tribunals must make decisions about relocation to Rwanda and review any such decisions on the basis that Rwanda is safe for the purposes of asylum, and in particular will not send someone on to another country, the practice of refoulement to which I referred earlier, in breach of the Refugee Convention. The Supreme Court's conclusions were based on the evidence submitted prior to the High Court hearing in September 2022, and did not, indeed could not, consider subsequent work and efforts by and with the government of Rwanda to strengthen the readiness of Rwanda to receive and support individuals relocated under the partnership. Crucially, my lords, this has included work to bolster Rwanda's asylum system in terms of both decision-making and processing by delivering new operational training to asylum decision-makers, establishing clear standard operating procedures which capture new processes, and guidance in the asylum system on reception and accommodation arrangements, the safeguarding of vulnerable persons, and access to health care. Strengthening the Republic of Rwanda's asylum system and appeals body, and strengthening procedural oversight of the Migration and Economic Development Partnership. When considered together with the legally binding provisions in the treaty, alongside the evidence of changes in Rwanda since the summer of 2022, this means Parliament can conclude with confidence that Rwanda is a safe country. My Lords, Clause 2 of the bill also contains a clear notwithstanding clause, requiring courts to honour the previous clauses, notwithstanding all relevant domestic law, the Human Rights Act to the extent disapplied by this bill, and any interpretation of international law reached by the court or tribunal. The government remains committed to ensuring rights and liberties are protected domestically and to fulfilling our international obligations. We will always ensure that our laws continue to be fit for purpose and work for the people of the United Kingdom. We recognise that some of the provisions in the bill are novel. However, the government is satisfied that the bill can be implemented in line with both our domestic law and our international obligations. And the provisions...
I'm very grateful to the noble Lord. Will he, before he sits down, tell us what the government's reflections are on the debate on the International Agreements Committee report in your Lordship's House last week? And will he also tell us clearly whether the government intends to send anyone to Rwanda under this bill, under this act, before all those concerns are met or not?
I'm obliged to the noble Lord for that intervention, and whether I deal with it in this part of the speech or whether it's left to the end, I'll consult with colleagues. My Lords, as I say, we recognise that some of the provisions in the bill are novel. However, the government is satisfied that it can be implemented in line with both domestic law and our international obligations. And the provisions in this bill will ultimately allow us to deter people from taking unsafe and illegal routes into the country. It is also clear to us all, my lords, that people will seek to frustrate their removal through any means, and to prevent people from making claims to prevent the removal, the bill disapplies elements of the Human Rights Act 1998. It disapplies Section 2 in relation to any systemic challenges to Parliament's settled view that Rwanda is safe, Section 3 in relation to the whole bill, and Sections 6 to 9, where the courts and others are considering whether Rwanda is safe and whether the test that must be met before removal is whether it will result in serious and irreversible harm. In the context of this bill, which deems Rwanda a safe country, this will ensure that people cannot frustrate removal by bringing systemic challenges in our domestic courts. And when considering any question relating to the safety of the Republic of Rwanda, domestic courts and tribunals are not required to have regard to the Strasbourg jurisprudence. It makes clear that the courts and tribunals should defer to Parliament's sovereign view that Rwanda is a safe country as defined. My Lords, the bill does not allow individuals to bring challenges against removal I beg your Lordship's pardon once again. The bill permits, it does allow individuals to bring challenges against removal to Rwanda in exceptionally narrow circumstances, where there is compelling evidence relating specifically to their particular individual circumstances. The basis upon which an individual may bring such a challenge is if an individual can demonstrate that there is a real and imminent risk that they would face serious or irreversible harm related to their particular individual circumstances if they were relocated. If people try to abuse this route by making claims without clear or compelling evidence, or in regard to general claims that they would be unsafe in Rwanda, their claim will be dismissed by the Home Office and they will be relocated from the UK before they can challenge that removal. It is possible, but not necessarily likely, that those subject to removal may be subject to injunctions from the European Court of Human Rights. The bill is clear that it is only for a Minister of the Crown, and a Minister alone, to determine whether to comply with an interim measure of the Strasbourg Court. It also makes clear that domestic courts may not have regard to the existence of any interim measure when considering any domestic application flowing from a decision to relocate a person to Rwanda in accordance with the treaty. My Lords, the terms of the treaty we have negotiated with Rwanda address the findings of the United Kingdom domestic courts, and they make specific provision for the treatment of relocated individuals, guaranteeing their safety and protection. The rule of law partnership we have signed with Rwanda is a partnership to which we and Rwanda are both completely committed, and this bill, along with the treaty, puts beyond legal doubt the safety of Rwanda. We want to make sure that this legislation works, my Lords, and it is essential that we act now and do whatever it takes to stop people being manipulated into making dangerous crossings across the Channel. Illegal migration is one of the most significant challenges of our time, and the government is acting in the national interest. My Lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time.
My Lords, this is the third time in as many years that the government has asked this House to consider legislation to stop boat journeys and to reform the asylum system. The third year of being presented with increasingly rushed, unworkable and inhumane solutions to the problem of small boats and asylum. There is a very real problem that needs fixing. This bill, like its predecessors, will not do that. The opposition does not support this bill or the schemes that underpin it. The record of votes cast at the second reading in this place and the third reading in the other place will attest to this. This bill, however, completed all stages in the House of Commons, and so our role is not to undermine the will of the elected House, nor is it to rush through legislation without due consideration. We must treat this bill in the usual manner. We must scrutinise the details of the proposals and advise changes where we think the government has got it wrong. We should not deny ourselves the opportunity to do so or deny our neighbours the chance to consider our work. And it is in this spirit that we will not be supporting the amendment by the noble Lord German. My Lords, this bill, as it stands, threatens the UK's compliance with international law. I know this point will be spoken on at length in further stages, and so I will not dwell on it for too long at this moment, nor will I speak for very long for what this bill demands of our domestic courts. When introducing this bill, the Secretary of State claimed that the UK is a country that demonstrates to the whole world the importance of international law. Is this the message that this bill sends to the world about the UK's respect for international law? How will the decisions we make now be cited in the future when other countries are asked to follow international law or respect human rights? Is this the contribution we want to make? And what does the bill say about our respect for our own courts? If the treaty fails, if refoulement happens, if there is a coup, or if asylum seekers are shot or killed, the government says that British courts cannot consider those facts. It is a large price to pay for what is ultimately a hugely limited scheme. The government has stated that the Rwanda government has made an initial provision to receive a few hundred people. To put this figure in context, over the first 9 months of 2023, 63,000 people claimed asylum. So this bill and this plan, even if somehow worked out in exactly the way the government hopes, would only relocate a small proportion of asylum cases. Can the government confirm whether Rwanda can still only receive a few hundred people? Can they outline what is to happen to everyone else? Given that the Illegal Migration Act, a majority of which has not yet been brought into force, rests on the idea of the use of third countries rather than returns to original countries of origin, are we right to question what will happen to the 99% of people who will not be sent to Rwanda? We still do not know the full cost of this scheme. The government has been reluctant at every stage to divulge the cost of this flagship policy. In December, the Secretary of State appeared to indicate that around £400 million will have been sent to the Rwandan government by 2027. Can the Minister confirm this figure? It's an extraordinary sum of money, but not the whole picture. According to the treaty, there are additional per-person costs of the scheme. The economic impact assessment for the illegal migration bill was only published after considerable pressure from noble lords from across the House. This document, in this document, the Home Office was prepared to tell us that the average imagined cost of sending an asylum seeker to a third country would be £169,000. However, the details of the treaty suggest that these costs may be higher for sending somebody to Rwanda. Before we begin to fully debate the details of this legislation and its role in the implementations of the Rwanda plan, will the Minister be clear about how much this plan is actually going to cost? This bill, whatever its impact, will not address the state of our asylum system that it is currently in. The UK deserves a managed asylum system that upholds strong border security and that can process claims fairly, accurately and quickly. A system that can return those with no claim to stay and help those who rightfully seek sanctuary. That is not our current asylum system. We have a backlog of 100,000 asylum claims waiting for decision, 40,000 people who have yet to be removed from the UK, and up to 17,000 people the government cannot account for. The pace of decision-making is improving, but the backlog that has been permitted to develop will take time to fully clear, and more work is needed. Nor will the bill help us negotiate returns agreements. Threats to our compliance with international law undermine our ability to establish returns agreements from other countries. Far from helping us, this bill may greatly harm our ability to reform our asylum system. The government has repeatedly said that it is motivated by a desire to see the end of criminal smuggler gangs and to prevent boats crossing in the first place. Yet this is now the third bill that seeks to end small boat crossings without any measures to directly target the gang activity behind them. In fact, the latest police workforce statistics show a fall in the number of National Crime Agency officers, the law enforcement body responsible for fighting against smuggling gangs. Between March and September 2023, their numbers fell by 343 personnel. £400 million is just under half of the total budget this year for the NCA. Would the government's money not be better spent increasing the size of operations fighting against human traffickers, working with European counterparts and going after the supply chain? This bill and the deal behind it will do nothing to stop boats coming to our shores. The government's plan hinges on the idea that the Rwanda scheme presents a deterrent effect without presenting any evidence that this will be the case. It is certainly difficult to imagine what deterrent effect
a 1 or 2% chance of being sent to Rwanda would have. It is even more difficult to imagine why this would stop criminal traffickers. Nor will the bill present those fleeing conflict and persecution with safe alternatives to channel crossings. Last summer, the government committed to publishing a report detailing existing and proposed additional safe and legal routes. A report has arrived, but it contains no proposal for creating safe routes for those seeking asylum. Can we assume then that the government's additional pledge to implement any proposed new routes by the end of this year is to be broken too? This was an issue that was raised repeatedly in both houses during the passage of the illegal migration bill, and it is disappointing that the government has not taken the request seriously. If we are to truly address the challenge of migration, we must accept that we cannot do so alone. The government is acting as though the challenge here is not related to those in other countries, particularly of our European friends. The UK lacks the leadership needed to succeed in a world now marked by increasing conflict, the climate emergency, and the erosion of law and order, for all of which fuel migration. We need to approach an approach that restores the AIDS budget, puts a renewed focus on conflict mitigation and resolution, and seeks international agreements and cooperation. An approach that is workable, strategic, humane, and rooted in the conventions which we have signed. My Lords, I will conclude shortly, but I want to mention that one colleague, my noble friend Lord Dubs, is unable to join us. He's in Berlin taking part in events to mark the anniversary of the Kindertransport, which began in late 1938. In June, it will be 85 years since he arrived in Britain, having been put on a train by his mother in Prague. Although we miss his contribution today, we can be reminded of what and who we gain when we play our part in helping those who flee conflict and persecution, and we look forward to his return. My Lords, I hope the House will not be deterred from changing this bill when it sees fit. It certainly needs our help. I hope too that the government, rather than trying to communicate through press conference, engages with this House in good faith and through more conventional channels. We are faced with a deeply broken system and layers of bad legislation which have only made things worse. I hope the government rethinks this bill, this plan and this approach to migration, but I fear we will be left without the change we need until we change the government.
Amendment, Lord Chairman.
My Lords, I beg leave to move the amendment standing in my name on the order paper, and in doing so, direct attention to my interests as laid out in the register. My Lords, the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees which this bill is seeking to effect is completely contrary to how we should be acting as a country with a reputation for protecting individuals' rights and freedoms, where the rule of law is upheld. I do not need to repeat the key points of last week's debate on the Rwanda Treaty, but the decision of this House is significant in respect of this bill. This House resolved that it could not ratify the treaty which the government is using to declare that Rwanda is safe. The House determined that the safeguards and protections outlined in the treaty must be fully implemented. The House agreed that future assurances of changes in the processing of asylum seekers in Rwanda were not sufficient. The changes needed to be fully operational and effective. But, my Lord, significantly, the treaty is the instrument by which the government declares it can state in this bill that Rwanda is safe. Clause 1(2)(b) is clear. It says, "This Act gives effect to the judgment of Parliament that the Republic of Rwanda is a safe country." But, my Lords, this House of Parliament has not determined that this is the case. The treaty is the platform on which this bill sits. And if this platform is not in place, the bill sinks. My Lords, the legs have come off the table, or put it another way, the bill's foundations have been removed. It was the settled will of this House last week that the treaty cannot yet be ratified. So how can this House consent to a bill which relies on that treaty having the approval of this House? This is critical because the decision of the Supreme Court was based on its analysis of the facts. The contrary case put forward by the government in this bill has not been supported by this House. The bill before us requires Parliament, and Parliament of course includes this House, to agree that, in our judgment as a House, Rwanda is safe. This House, in this respect, needs to be consistent with itself, with the decision it took last week. This bill places the UK at risk of breaching our commitments under international law. We, as a country, have signed up to comply with the obligations of these international treaties and conventions. Having done that, we need to demonstrate that as a country, we can be relied upon to uphold international treaties and that we promote a rules-based international order. Because if we do not, then we cannot expect others to comply. We are in no position to call out other countries when they fail to comply with international law. The West is often accused of double standards, and under this legislation, this accusation will only increase. Our global leadership, our ability to have a serious voice on the world's voice is respected and listened to. We simply cannot rely on our historical traditions when our current actions are going in the opposite direction. Global responsibility sharing is the foundation of the 1951 Refugee Convention. It relies on us all doing our part. The government says this plan is a partnership and burden sharing, but frankly, it's offloading. Offloading the most vulnerable people on our planet and offloading our responsibilities under international agreements we are signed up to. If this bill is enacted, we would be legislating contrary to our international legal obligations. Our domestic law would be out of step with these obligations. Now, some might say that is acceptable, but I don't believe that's the case. I think this House will stand up for the object and the purpose of these international instruments to which we are signed up. Our courts would have their hands tied by this legislation. There's a strong possibility, particularly without pre-existing safeguards being proved operational and effective in Rwanda, that this would lead to refoulement and breaches of Article 2 and 3 rights. And this is why it's critical for the steps set out in the treaty to be seen to be working before this bill can have any effect. The bill introduces the option for ministers to refuse to comply with a Rule 39 injunction from the European Court of Human Rights. Ignoring an injunction would be a clear breach of international law, as the President of the Court declared last week. And this view is strengthened by the Rule 39 reforms, which the Court itself has introduced. Domestically, this bill undermines the rule of law, and further, it ousts the jurisdiction of our courts. The rule of law is a central tenet of our society, expressed by A.V. Dicey, well known to all lawyers, who wrote, "We speak of the rule of law as a characteristic of our country. Not only that with us no man is above the law, but that here every man, whatever be his rank or condition, is subject to the ordinary law of the realm and amenable to the jurisdiction of the ordinary tribunals." My noble friend Lord Thomas of Gresford will elaborate on this in his contribution. This bill seeks to exclude a group of people from accessing the legal protections we grant to everyone else in our society. It is critical in a democratic society that the law is applied equally, that human rights apply to everyone, not just some in our society. The government's bill prevents the right to access redress, which is afforded to the rest of us. Further, this bill is an abuse of Parliament's role in reversing the Supreme Court's factual assessment of risk of harm in Rwanda. If the government believes they have new evidence to show that Rwanda is safe, then surely the correct procedure is to follow it, is to let the courts decide it and consider the evidence and come to a judgment. That's the proper way to go. If Rwanda was indeed safe, there would be no need to have the option to ignore interim injunctions from the ECHR or disapply elements of the Human Rights Act. This bill represents an overreach of Parliament, and it's critical that we retain the balance in our democracy achieved by the separation of powers. Despite all this, The bill won't actually achieve its stated aim, and it certainly doesn't represent good value to the taxpayer, £368 million at the last count. Added to that, at least £169,000 for each person removed to Rwanda. These are staggering, eye-watering costs, which could pay for 100 million free school meals or nearly 6 million more GP appointments. Far from being a deterrent, this bill will promote smuggling, a point which my noble friend Baroness Northover will develop in her remarks. It doesn't address real solutions to prevent people using criminal gangs to take dangerous journeys to the UK. The focus on deterrence is misplaced. 2/3 of all those who have crossed the Channel since the Illegal Migration Act was passed came from 6 high-grant countries. The push factor for these people is far stronger than any deterrent the UK may dream up. We need safe alternatives to dangerous journeys, and this must be part of the strategy to reduce dangerous crossings. Swift, efficient, accurate and just determination of asylum claims and humane removal of those who do not qualify will be a deterrent in itself to people without a protection claim. We also need constructive engagement with European neighbours on cooperation around asylum. Addressing the root causes of displacement and onward movement is critical, and a strong international aid and development budget is key to that. Instead, we are presented with a political totem of the Tory right, a device to satisfy their internal party politics, a bill for which there is no going back. If Rwanda is found to be unsafe, then this bill will act as a block to putting matters right. This legislation was not in the government's manifesto. The Addison-Salisbury Convention doesn't apply. I maintain that this is one of the rare occasions which has been used by both Conservative and Labour parties in this House, and as was foreseen by a report of the Constitution Committee, when this House should vote against a bill at second reading. It is within our powers, as described in the companion. My Lords, this bill asks us to build...
Grateful to Lord Jermyn for giving way. I wonder if he agrees with me that the function of this House, second chamber, is a revising chamber. It's not a vetoing chamber, it's a revising chamber. So can you explain to me Liberal Democrat novel, I think, constitutional thinking, that by throwing out this bill on second reading, he is prevent the revising chamber from revising?
Well, I'm afraid that the noble lord is wrong, because I think in 2011 he voted against the Health and Social Care Bill at second reading, as has happened before in earlier versions by members of the Conservative Party. So if our laws and our rules of this House say we can do it, then we can do it, and it has been done by both sides here. I maintain, and this chamber should listen to the real power of what people will be saying this afternoon about the nature of this particular bill. Because, my lords, this bill asks us to believe that black is white, that facts are not facts. It breaches conventions and treaties to which we're signed up. It damages our credibility on the world stage. And, of course, the agreements that we have with other countries. It seeks to damage our relationships with things that we've already signed up to, including the European Convention on Trafficking, including the CTA with the European Union, including the United Nations, including the ECHR, and many more. It damages the separation of powers in this country, which is a fundamental tenet of our democracy. It offends against the rule of law. And, my lords, fundamentally, it treats some of the most vulnerable people in the world, people who are facing persecution, torture, and fleeing for their lives, as undesirables. And for us on these benches, that is unconscionable. I beg to move.
The original question was that this bill be now read a second time, since when an amendment has been moved to leave out from that to the end and insert the words set out on the order paper. The question I now therefore have to put is that this amendment be agreed to.
My Lords, the United Kingdom is a three-legged stool. Each of the legs, the judiciary, the government and parliament, wax and wane a bit in their thickness as power shifts in small ways. A subject of much work and comment for my predecessor, the noble and learned Lord Judge. But each leg is required to operate independently to ensure that balance, the balance at the core of our democracy. It would not do for one of the legs to instruct another as to how to operate or how to look at a particular issue. And by way of example, it would be quite wrong if the House of Lords sought to instruct the judiciary as to whether to hear a particular case. I do hope that the Prime Minister, sitting atop, as he does, the government leg of the stool, will reflect on those simple thoughts as he thinks back to his words of the 18th of January at the Downing Street press conference concerning our role and this bill. The duties of this House are inextricably linked with a series of conventions by which we, an unelected chamber, cohabit with our elected neighbour. Among these conventions, the Addison-Salisbury or Salisbury Convention is especially pertinent today and to this bill in general. The convention has a number of parts, but in simplifying matters for reasons of time, one is that a government bill with manifesto characteristics will be given a second reading in the House. You can see that the convention has a number of people concerned about it, and as you know, I'm preparing a series of papers on this convention at the moment. For my part, I feel that this convention is engaged here, and accordingly I will not be supporting the amendment to the second reading motion in the name of the noble Lord Jermyn. The convention also has elements concerning the speed with which the House will consider things. The House is already assisting the speed of consideration of this bill. We've changed our business around and freed up today for the second reading. 3 days have been set aside for committee, which, given the likely number of amendments that will be tabled, could only work if the House sits late. And by that I mean to at least midnight, and probably on 2 of those 3 days. I'm sure, however, that on those days, and late, the benches will be very full, and the quality of the debate will remain very high with our natural and respectful tone. I expect that this House will send back various matters to the other place for their consideration, to think again, as is our role, and I imagine that we will then enter a ping-pong phase. Conventions will apply if agreement cannot be reached, but the elected House at the end of the full due process has the right to pass law, whether that law be good law or whether that law be bad law. In the meantime, this House will engage in our full processes, uncowed by any creaks and groans in the other legs of the stool.
My Lords, in almost every tradition of global faith and of humanism around the world, the dignity of the individual is at the heart of what is believed. In the Christian tradition, we are told to welcome the stranger. Jesus said, "I was a stranger and you invited me in." In numerous places in the Old Testament and New, the commands of God are to care for alien and stranger. My Lords, it has already been said, and I agree with it, that the way this bill and its cousin that we debated in the summer works is to obscure the truth that all people, asylum seekers included, are of great value. We can, as a nation, do better than this bill. With this bill, the government is continuing to seek good objectives in the wrong way, leading the nation down a damaging path. It is damaging for asylum seekers in need of protection and safe and legal routes to be heard. It is damaging for this country's reputation, which it contradicts even as late as last week where the Prime Minister himself spoke eloquently on the value and importance of international law for this country. It is damaging in respect of constitutional principles and the rule of law. And most of all, my lords, it is damaging for our nation's unity in a time when the greatest issues of war, peace, defence and security need us to be united. We are united on, I think, almost all benches in agreeing the boats must be stopped, and the government is to be congratulated that the number has come down, that the people smugglers who trade in human misery must be brought to justice, and it is good news that so many groups have been broken up. And we need to be united on effective controls on agreed limits to immigration. The right way forward, though, is to enable the unity on ends to be translated into a unity on means. And that is not happening in the way these bills are successively brought to the House and brought before the country. The challenge of migration is, as has been said, long-term and global, and so must our response be. We need a wider strategy. I spoke at this at boring length in the summer, and I won't repeat it. We need a wider strategy for refugee policy, which involves international cooperation and equips us for the far greater migration flows, perhaps 10 times greater, in the coming decades as a result of conflict and climate change and poverty. Instead, this bill offers only ad hoc one-off approaches. Rwanda is a country I know well. It is a wonderful country, and my complaint is not with Rwanda, nor with its people. It has overcome challenges that this House cannot begin to imagine. But this bill continues, wherever it does it, to outsource our legal and moral responsibilities for refugees and asylum seekers, when other countries far poorer are already supporting multitudes more than we are now, and to cut back on our aid. 76% of refugees globally are being hosted in low and middle income countries at the end of 22, countries far poorer than our own. The UK should lead internationally, as it has in the past, not stand apart. Others on these benches will say more about international and domestic law, human rights and constitutional impact. I will simply say that a pick-and-choose approach to international law undermines our global standing and offends against the principle of universality that is their increasingly threatened foundation. Finally, I and my colleagues on these benches take its revising role seriously. When we vote to seek to improve something. I will, sadly, not be voting with those who want to vote this bill down today, although I found Lord Jermyn's speech convincing and powerful. But I think we have to wait until third reading and have done our revising work. We have been criticised many times over many decades on these benches here by those thinking defence of the government of the day should be our highest virtue and aspiration. We were accused last week of voting against the government's whip. I'm sorry to say we don't take the government's whip. It may be worse news for this House to recognise that on those benches, on the Labour benches, it's not 95%, which is a false statistic, of times that there's been a vote against the government whip. It's been 100%. Maybe they should be criticised for that obnoxious behaviour. We serve on these benches as independent members. Last week, as recently as Thursday, we were discussing what had happened in a particular vote, and we saw that we'd cancelled each other out. Bishops often cancel each other out in every possible way. We vote because we feel that we value deeply the traditions of this country and this house and the truth we derive from the Bible and our service to Jesus Christ, our first priority. Slightly to misquote Luther, on that we stand, we can do no other.
My Lords, this chamber has had to consider many complex and challenging bills, as has already been observed, and this bill is in that category. Legal experts and experienced hands in the realm of international affairs in your Lordship's House will have their views, and we've already heard some of them. But I am looking at this issue through a different prism, one based on pragmatism, not party political tribalism, and certainly not ideology. The exploitation of vulnerable, frightened people by repugnant criminal gangs and extortionists is unacceptable, and it must be stopped. Watching and listening to the harrowing accounts of overturned boats and drownings in the Channel demands that action be taken. Little dignity in any of that for these poor souls. What I have gleaned is that across the gamut of opinions about these perilous Channel crossings, one inescapable conclusion is drawn. Something must be done. The Most Reverend Primate referred to that. But paradoxically, with the exception of the government's proposals, I have seen no other credible, deliverable solution advanced. And so far in this debate, I'm afraid to say, that lacuna remains. So I have been prompted to speak in this debate in support of the government, not because I consider this measure is excellent, but because I think it is the only thing to do. And I therefore do not support the noble Lord German's amendment. Why are the criminal gangs able to extort money from these vulnerable victims? Well, regrettably and tragically, it is because their victims, desperate to reach the UK, feel that any risk, even the risk of drowning in the Channel, is worth taking, and the gangs ruthlessly exploit that desperation. The gangs couldn't care less about the safety of the migrants. All they care about is money. So we have to cut off that money supply, and that will only happen if migrants seeking to come here illegally realise they will not be able to stay here. And I would say to the noble Lord on the benches opposite, there is an example. The examples of Australia and Albania indicate that approach does work. Now, recent measures to reduce the flow, and they have been referred to, can only ever be a mitigation. The government is obliged to find a solution, and I believe this bill with the accompanying treaty provides it. This solution is not perfect, but I do not believe that a perfect solution exists. Those who believe it does have yet to produce it. I am clear that pragmatism has to usurp perfection, and we have to act. I am in no doubt that the bill and the treaty place onerous obligations on the government. I do not agree that the treaty should be delayed for reports to Parliament and how the arrangements are unfolding. We shall only know how the treaty and bill are working once the arrangements have been delivered in practice. There is no other way to make a meaningful assessment. On the face of the treaty and on the face of this bill, there are explicit safeguards, but these require the UK government to know in detail who has been sent to Rwanda, where they are, what is happening to them, the outcome of the individual's application, and of course continuing engagement with the Rwandan government. Without that information, the United Kingdom government is not in a position to assess if these safeguards are being met. So can my noble friend the Minister reassure me on these points? My Lords, I am clear that parliamentary sovereignty is a uniquely precious attribute. It is fundamental to a nation's democratic freedoms that when a grave and extraordinary situation confronts that nation, the government must be able to act, and act untrammelled. I am sure that it was never intended that the laudable arrangements entered into long ago by different nations would, as climate challenges emerged, render these nations powerless to deal with them. That would be perverse. Mainland European countries are now wrestling with such challenges. And that is why I believe Section 2 and the other provisions in this bill are justified and necessary. And can I make two final points to my noble friend the Minister? In Scotland, we have a worrying skills deficit, incapable of supplement from the indigenous population. Are we clear that where such deficits exist, we are realistic about the need to meet them, including from immigrant applicants? And in relation to asylum seekers, in my own community, many volunteers have supported asylum seekers with language education, provision of clothes, and including them in social activities such as attending my own local church and church events. There now seems to be a Home Office instruction to disperse asylum seekers, separating them from that human contact and support. So in conclusion, may I ask my noble friend the Minister, is that a sensible approach, and can he offer me any reassurance on that point?
My Lords, I'm pleased to follow the noble Baroness, for whom I have great respect, but telling asylum seekers to suck it and see, to find themselves in Rwanda, and if we've made a mistake, we might be able to do something about it, is frankly ridiculous. And I say to the noble Minister, the noble Lord the Minister, who clearly has a terrific job in reading out something he didn't agree with, I just say to him, when you mentioned resettlement routes, which did used to exist, the resettlement was from other dangerous parts of the world to the UK, not from the UK to other countries. And I want this afternoon, in the brief time available, in a moment, to address that issue, because others have and will address the question of convention rights, the morality, the reputation of this country, the clash between the different parts of our constitution, which has already been mentioned. I happen to take a Jonathan Sumption view of the balance between Parliament and the courts. But there's one thing that's absolutely clear in the Nationality and Borders Act, in the Illegal Migration Act, and now in this so-called Safety of Rwanda bill, that this is nothing to do with finding solutions. It's everything to do to virtue signalling, as you might, in quotes, put virtue, to a particular part of the electorate, and to find scapegoats for government failure. The scapegoats are, of course, the opposition, the courts themselves, and this House. And this House cannot fall into elephant traps by allowing the government to say that if only they'd been able to process this bill and they'd been able to show the British people that this worked, then they would have been able to do so. But because this House declined to give a second reading, they weren't able to do so. It's a very silly and old elephant trap, and anyone who falls into it needs to take a degree in politics. I just want to say this about the issues before us today. It seems to me that members of the House of Commons, Tory members of the House of Commons, didn't understand the issue of the one-way ticket to Rwanda. You can understand the electorate not understanding something which we've never ever done before. In fact, we've said the opposite. Time and time again, the government have said that asylum seekers should have chosen to claim asylum in the last country they were in. This is the last country they will have been in when they're sent to Rwanda. Refused by the illegal migration bill the right to claim, but only to claim in Rwanda. And I ask you in the wind-ups, what will they be claiming? Will they be claiming asylum in Rwanda? What happens if they choose not to claim asylum in Rwanda, having chosen to claim asylum in the United Kingdom under their convention rights? And if they don't claim asylum, will they be at risk? If they do claim asylum, and with the help of the UK judiciary, who are in massive short supply, by the way, met a barrister this weekend who was defending an individual 4 years on from the alleged crime. Our judiciary and court and criminal justice system in meltdown. We're going to send people over there to try and ensure that this is safe. When someone has their asylum claim processed and a duly accorded refugee status, why are they not allowed to come back to the United Kingdom? If Georgia Maloney, who's addressing African leaders today, can say that her offshoring proposals would allow the return to Italy, Lord help us, the brothers of Italy can do it, but our Tory government in 2024 can't. What sort of country are we? And if you can't return, then all the risks that are being debated on this bill click in, including, by the way, what happens to the most vulnerable when they don't get the proper treatment and support after their claim has been approved. And when they do get their claim approved and they're allowed to settle in Rwanda, what would stop them in time being able to come to the United Kingdom? Surely they'd have travel rights, or are they imprisoned in Rwanda? These are questions I hope will be addressed at the end of this afternoon's debate, but make no mistake about it. We are not dealing here with practical issues. Yes, the Albanian agreement was a success, quite rightly. It is entirely responsible for the drop in numbers. What is not in any doubt in my mind, that the threat to asylum seekers, because it's not a threat to traffickers, the threat to asylum seekers is not the reason we've had the drop so far. And what will achieve that drop is Britain getting its act together, securing the borders, ensuring the processing, and yes, reaching further agreements with the French. What won't do it is the Safety of Rwanda bill, which is shoddy and less than this country deserves.
I greatly admire Lord Jermyn, but I can't support his amendment. I dislike the bill as much as he does. I explained in last week's debate at length why I disliked it. In the time available today, I just want to add 2 points. First, sequencing. I was struck as a member of the International Agreements Committee by Rwanda's rejection rate for asylum seekers from Afghanistan and Syria. It's 100%. Rwanda has always rejected them all out of hand. That was one of the reasons why the committee recommended, the IEC recommended, and the House last week resolved that the new treaty should not be ratified until the reforms prescribed in the treaty have actually been implemented. The government clearly accepted the Supreme Court's ruling that without these reforms the Rwanda scheme would be unsafe, and the House agreed, adding that fine words weren't enough, what matters would be implementation. Until the new systems are up and running, and none of them yet are, Rwanda can't be deemed safe for those the government want to send there. Yet, my lords, that is precisely what Clause 2 of the bill does. We are asked to deem Rwanda already safe now, today. And we're asked to require everyone, individuals and courts, from the moment the bill becomes law, to treat Rwanda as safe. This is Lewis Carroll country. In Alice, the Queen believed 6 impossible things before breakfast. To make sense of the nonsense, we have to get the sequencing right. It has to be first implementation, Rwanda reforms. Second, ratification, when Parliament is satisfied that Rwanda has reformed. And third, legislation. A bill, maybe this bill, when all are clear that Clause 2, the determination of safety, is based on real facts, not Trumpian alternative facts. And if the government insists on reversing the right sequence, they must surely consider amending Clause 9 to introduce appropriate commencement conditionality so that our looking-glass world aligns with reality. My only other point concerns deterrence. Clause 1 of the bill says its purpose is to prevent and deter unlawful migration, and the government makes much play with the deterrent effect. I can't see it. The Home Office Permanent Secretary couldn't see it either, or at least he couldn't quantify it, and so couldn't justify the Rwanda scheme as providing value for money, just as the lawyers won't let the Home Secretary claim it's compatible with convention rights. Those seeking asylum here are fleeing from war, torture, famine, persecution. In the year to last September, 93,000 applied, 46,000 arriving on small boats. The largest groups, much the largest groups, came from Afghanistan, Iran, Eritrea, Sudan, and Syria. Of those in these groups whose cases were considered, there's still a backlog of 165,000, 75% of whom wait for more than 6 months. The large majority of the cases considered, over 99% of the Afghans and the Syrians whose cases were considered, were granted refugee status. So our rejection rate verges on 0. The Rwanda rate is 100%. It's hardly surprising it verges on 0. We know all about the Taliban and the Ayatollahs, the atrocities and the bombing. It's absurd to suggest that these people wouldn't have tried to come here, risking the Channel Passage, if they'd heard about our Rwanda scheme. If you're an Afghan, now in Pakistan, at the risk of being sent back now, you've already faced far greater dangers than the Channel. Crossing the Mediterranean kills many more than does the Channel. If you've made it to Calais, and 9,000 Afghans did last year, would you turn round and go home if we passed this bill? Of course you wouldn't. Supposing the government had been able to send 200 to Rwanda last year, as they hoped, 200 out of 46,000 small boat arrivals, so less than a 0.5% risk of Rwanda. If you'd heard about it in Calais, it certainly wouldn't have deterred you. Of course, there would be some deterrent effect if the Rwanda system stays unreformed, maintaining its 100% rejection rate. But the reforms, if they're implemented, will eliminate that. Any vestigial deterrence disappears as Rwanda reforms. The policy eats the policy. It's a Goya. Saturn is devouring his children. So I profoundly believe that the deterrence argument just doesn't stack up. The Rwanda scheme will not break the smugglers' business model. What would put them out of business, as Lord Jermyn said, is new, safe and legal routes. But there are none in the government's Section 61 report, despite what we were led to expect. Or like the Italians in Albania, we could try offshore processing, but instead of offshoring, we're offloading with a treaty that offloads responsibility in defiance of convention commitments and a bill to create alternative facts in Africa. Next step, shall we legislate the sky green and the grass blue?
My Lords, Rwanda, rather like that venerated old Irishman, I wouldn't have started from this point either, but we do. And so many countries are struggling. Germany, France, Greece, little Malta, and even the muscular Turks, who have 3.5 million refugees massed on their southern border. The challenge is being felt around the world, not just here. I wish some years ago we could have realized the world's new direction of travel and accepted that the international conventions on human rights and refugees were created for a very different era. Before jumbo jets, before the criminal gangs and modern slavers, and before the scourge of mutant lawyers whose objective isn't to uphold the law, but to evade it. I wish we had reached out to others, tried to create new conventions and a new understanding of the challenges of mass migration, but we haven't. And while that must surely eventually happen, many countries are struggling with the short-term consequences. This bill is not our final destination. It's a means to a specific end, and the end is clear: to break that sickening trade of the people smugglers, to protect the weak, the children, the vulnerable young women, and to smash the criminal gangs whose trade is human flesh. Now, I believe that we in Britain have come closer to living out Martin Luther's
King's dream of racial togetherness than perhaps any other country in the world. I've spoken before in this House about that. It's work in progress, of course, but this dream, his dream, has taken root here. We are a good and a decent people. Yet that is under significant threat. Look elsewhere. Wir schaffen es, Angela Merkel said. Oh, no, she didn't. And look what is happening today in Germany as a result, and France, and elsewhere. Extremism and intolerance are on the rise. Now, no one is pretending that there are easy solutions, but the problem is real, it is growing, it is a pressing and present danger to us all, and even here we might find that we so easily fall back into those dark days when race was a dividing line that cut so deeply through our community. Yes, these are all connected issues, and no amount of hand-wringing is going to make it go away. And I might say that there's no dignity of the individual to be found in a small boat in the hand of people smugglers. So to all those who have their doubts, who say they don't like this direction, who claim the moral high ground, I simply ask, what is your alternative? How will you smash the evil trade? How long will you wait, watching the suffering, refusing to offer any hint of an alternative solution, content to sleep comfortably in your beds, wrapped up in your consciences? The opposition, so silent about what they would do, say that we are rushing things through. The words from the opposition front bench, from the noble Lord Ponsonby, will delay. They insist, will do nothing. It's the silence of the lambs. While ordinary, decent British people want us to do things more rapidly, they believe that we have not moved fast enough. And if I've got it wrong, I'm looking forward very much to hearing the specifics of what the opposition would do instead. Yes, we'll wait, and we will wait, and we will wait. So, look, weigh a doubt against a certainty, my lords. The doubts about the destination in which we are asked to travel against the certainty that if we stand still and do nothing, the consequences for this country are likely to be catastrophic.
My lords, to understand a nation and its people, you need a feel for the inner bundle of practices, characteristics, and states of mind, which create the image of a country carries of itself, which in turn shapes the way that others see it. For those of us fortunate enough to have been nurtured within the bounds of our cherished archipelago in the cold northern seas, the rule of law has a fair claim to be the most lustrous of our values, almost talismanic in its properties. So anything that threatens, weakens, or tarnishes our crucial defining value, the inspirational principle for governing and living well together, is a first-order matter. I regret to say, my lords, that the bill before us today falls into that category. For this is a moment of immense significance for Parliament, the judiciary, our people, and the very quality of our democracy. In no way do I diminish the electric charge of the question of uncontrolled immigration generates, but I fear that the government has become fixated on its talisman, the Rwanda policy, which ministers claim will break the economic model of the cruel, evil, heartless people who put the boats and their desperate passengers to sea off the beaches of northern France. For what it's worth, my lords, my own view is that it cannot be beyond the capability of Whitehall to work up a scheme for the swift dispatch of asylum claims with safe and humane shelter provided in the UK for claimants while they wait for the results of their applications. By rushing this emergency legislation through Parliament with the intention of getting the deportation flights to Kigali underway by late spring, the government has already secured for itself a special place in British political history.
The day may not be far off when the Rwanda Bill, having cleared all its parliamentary stages, will be forwarded from the Cabinet Office to Buckingham Palace to receive the royal assent. In the few minutes it takes to pass down the Mall and across the tip of St James's Park on its return journey to Whitehall, our country will change. For the government will have removed us from the list of rule of law nations. We shall be living in a different land, breathing a different air in a significantly diminished kingdom. My lords, is this what any of us really want?
My lords, it's easy to list the defects in the Rwanda proposal. It's expensive. It's cumbersome. It's, as we were told at the beginning, it's taken up an inordinate amount of parliamentary time without any guarantee that it won't yet be challenged in the courts. And let's admit that there is something slightly distasteful. There's an aesthetic objection to shifting the problem halfway around the world. I get all that. I've heard all the arguments, believe me, my lords, I've heard them from many of the people in the chamber now. As Lord Ponsonby reminded us at the beginning, we've spent a great deal of time debating this 3 times in as many years. And I've heard those arguments very eloquently articulated, but I have not heard a plausible and credible alternative. Politics is often a choice between imperfect outcomes. In fact, these days it is almost always such a choice. In an ideal world, there'd be no need for a Rwanda scheme. In an ideal world, we'd have a Rolls-Royce Home Office bureaucracy where all claims were processed swiftly and immediately. In an ideal world, we would have no judges who push the limits in an attempt to overturn deportation orders. We'd have a judiciary that rules solely on the basis of what the law says rather than what it feels the law ought to say. In an ideal world, we'd have neighbouring countries that played by the rules of the game and took back people who had entered our territory improperly from theirs. In an ideal world, international conventions would have kept up with changing circumstances. But, my lords, the world we live in is not ideal. It is gross and sublunary, and we have to make choices which are less than perfect. I think we are deluding ourselves when we repeat pieties about smashing gangs, as though somehow if you took away the people who are offering the supply, that the demand would dry up. The demand comes not from gangs, but from the fact that people understand very well what the figures say here, which is that once you've entered this country, it is highly unlikely that you will ever be removed from it. And I also think that there is a certain wishful thinking in what seems, I'm willing to be corrected, what seems to be the main argument of the opposition, which is that all of this can be solved with better collaboration across the channel, as though that's something that nobody's thought of before or that nobody has tried before. I looked up just before the speech the figures from when we were last subject to EU jurisdiction and were covered by the returns agreement. So in 2020, we attempted to return to other EU countries 8,502 people who shouldn't have been here, people who'd arrived here improperly, and we succeeded in removing 105 of them. The other way around, the rest of the EU tried to remove 2,331 to the United Kingdom, and we accepted 882, a rather significantly higher proportion. It seems to me very difficult to argue that a returns agreement with the EU would mean anything other than taking more people from the EU than we send there. My lords, I'm not going to argue that the Rwanda scheme will be alone enough to solve the problem. It won't even be the biggest component of it. I think there is more to be done in terms of individual return agreements. We've all heard, I think there was agreement on all sides about the efficacy of the Albania scheme, as the noble Lord Blunkett said. I think there's more to be done in terms of speeding up claims. And yes, there is probably more to be done in terms of collaboration. But it is part of a package to have some element of deterrence. The facts of geography mean that people have to pass through several safe countries on their way here. And if they think that there is a prospect that they will end in Rwanda, even if it is a percentage chance and not a certainty, that is bound to have some impact on whether they make their final claim here or in another safe country en route. And it's in that spirit, not in any great mood of joy or enthusiasm, but in rather a spirit of grim realism, that I oppose Lord Jermyn's motion and support the legislation.
Yeah. My Lords, Baroness Brinton is taking part remotely. I invite Baroness Brinton to speak.
My Lords, Lord Hannan speaks with his usual eloquence. I think one of the problems from our benches is that he seems to think it is an acceptable risk to actually breach the rule of law. And it's that fundamental issue that certainly my noble friend Lord German set out in his motion, and why this unusually should be something that we should vote against at second reading. My Lords, this weekend, the iPaper reported that 4 Rwandans have been granted refugee status in Britain over well-founded fears of persecution. Now, these cases are in addition to 6 people who Home Office figures suggest had asylum claims approved between April 2022 and September 23, according to The Observer. So how can the Prime Minister say that Kigali is unequivocally safe? My Lords, I want to raise a couple of issues in the short time that I have available on the details of how this will work. Firstly, Lord Dalton referred to access to healthcare, but the British Medical Association raised the important point that the use of offshoring has previously led to asylum seekers being removed to countries where they are unable to access medical care that they need. Medical reviews of 36 people under threat of removal to Rwanda revealed that 26 displayed medical indicators of having been tortured. My Lords, is it right that people like that should be going elsewhere? The government website on the agreement with Rwanda talks about age assessment for both accompanied and unaccompanied child asylum seekers. It says at point 4 that it confirms it will not seek to relocate unaccompanied individuals who are deemed to be under the age of 18. Any who are subsequently in relocation deemed by a court of tribunal in the UK to be either under 18 or treated temporarily as being under the age of 18 shall be returned to the United Kingdom. So can I ask the Minister the following questions? How is that going to work if they're assessed in Rwanda? How is the decision made on who are deemed to be under the age, given the provisions of the Nationality and Borders Act 2022 and the Illegal Migration Act 2023 and the arrangements set out in the Rwanda Treaty? And will an unaccompanied child or young person have been entitled to appeal prior to removal to Rwanda? Or will, as the latter part of that paragraph implies, they will be sent to Rwanda, assessed with other asylum seekers, and then only returned to the UK? My Lords, that is against the United Nations Rights of the Child Declaration. And will Rwanda use age assessment, as we debated in the Nationality and Borders Bill and the Illegal Migration Bill in their passages? And I particularly ask an issue about those who are accompanied, but to remain with their families. And it's good that families are kept together. But Rwanda does not have a secondary school system. So does the arrangement that is being made with Rwanda ensure that these children will have access to education if they're at secondary age? My Lords, Open Democracy reported that LGBTQ asylum seekers in Rwanda have previously been given immediate verbal rejections by officials responsible for registering applications, who said, quote, "It is not a place for them," or Rwanda does not deal with such issues, according to evidence from UNHCR submitted to the Home Office. So, my Lords, is it appropriate for these vulnerable people to be sent to Rwanda? And finally, my Lords, the Illegal Migration Bill stipulates that if someone arrives in the UK irregularly, there will be a duty on the Home Secretary to detain and remove them, even those arriving who are known to be victims of modern slavery. So, in the passage of this bill in the Commons, Theresa May, former Prime Minister and Home Secretary, said that it would consign more people to slavery if they went to Rwanda. Lord Dobbs asked what opposition parties will do. We would ensure swift and effective assessment of cases, but what we will not do is to send them to a country where we do not yet understand how the treaty will work. Because what is said in the treaty is that there are arrangements proposed, but they have not yet been sorted. For vulnerable asylum seekers, that is not good enough. It's certainly not good enough for what any British government and British Parliament should do. So above all, my Lords, for vulnerable people, for Rwanda is not a safe place. And as the treaty says quite specifically, there is much still to be sorted out. I believe that this House should not agree to this bill at second reading.
My Lords, the movement of large numbers of people seeking asylum is in danger of overwhelming the international asylum system, as the government's policy statement on the bill suggests. And this does require a different response. And there appears to me to be two alternatives. Work collaboratively with all countries affected, a global response to a global problem, or take this government's approach, working in the United Kingdom's sole interests, or arguably in the interests of party politics. As the most reverend primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, said in this House on the 12th of July last year, Hansard column 1872, and I quote, "This is a massive international issue on a generational basis. It is essential that the solutions as we go forward bring together the whole of politics, all sides of both houses, and unite our country instead of using this as a wedge issue to divide things," something the Most Reverend Primate reiterated this afternoon. The government quotes figures from last year where boat arrivals into mainland Europe apparently increased by 80%, while boat arrivals into the UK fell by about a third, according to the Noble Lord the Minister in his opening remarks, as if this is some kind of victory. I'm sure for domestic party political purposes it might look that way, but I doubt our European neighbours see it in the same light. "I'm all right, Jack" does not translate well in continental Europe. The government insists that the Rwanda scheme is only one part of the plan to stop the boats, cooperation with our European neighbours arguably being a far more important part of the plan. What will our European neighbours think if, as the Prime Minister seems intent on doing, the United Kingdom ignores so-called pyjama injunctions issued by a so-called foreign court? What the government, of course, is referring to are Rule 39 indications issued by the European Court of Human Rights, an international court of which the UK is a member. As the Noble Lord German has said, last Thursday, the President of the ECHR said, and I quote, "Where states have in the past failed to comply with Rule 39 indications, judges have found that the states have violated their obligations under Article 34 of the Convention." If the government decides, like Russia, it no longer wishes to be bound by international law, because, like Russia, it does not agree with the decisions of judges of the ECHR, then it should ask Parliament to remove the United Kingdom from the European Court of Human Rights. 2 days on from Holocaust Memorial Day, perhaps we should remember why the UK was instrumental in establishing such a court and consider the impact such a withdrawal would have on the